Sign it, or I tell him you're the one who took his money." That was the first full sentence my mother said to me at 1 in the morning, standing in my doorway in the rain with her mascara running and a folder clutched against her chest like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Behind her, idling at the curb, was a black truck I didn't recognize. And inside it, a man I would later learn was named Castellano, the kind of man who lends $50,000 in cash with no paperwork and collects in ways that don't involve courts. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked past her, down the hall of my building, where the motion sensor light had clicked on and made everything that ugly hospital yellow. And I felt something I'd been waiting my whole life to feel and never thought I would. I felt calm. "Come in," I said. "You're letting the heat out." She came in. She always came in. She had spent 31 years walking into rooms that belonged to me and treating them like waiting areas. Let me back up. Because if I just tell you what happened that week, you'll think I'm a monster, and I want you to understand that I'm not. Or maybe I am. I've stopped being sure that the word means anything. What I am for certain is the person who reads the fine print. I've always been that person. In my family, that made me the help. I was born in a March snowstorm in 1993, and the way my mother tells it, I came 3 weeks early and ruined a vacation. My father left before I learned to walk. I don't remember him, and the few photos that survived show a man who is already half turned toward the door. My mother never forgave me for being the thing she was holding when he decided to go. She didn't say it in those words. She didn't have to. You learn the shape of a thing by the shape of the hole it leaves. My brother came along 4 years later, and he came along on the same August afternoon that my mother's lottery scratcher hit for $10,000. I'm not exaggerating for effect. She tells that story at every holiday. The baby and the windfall, arriving together like the universe finally apologizing. He was the good news, I was the bill. So that's the arithmetic I grew up inside. He was the sun, and I was the thing that kept the lights on after dark. By the time I was 12, I was making his lunches. By 15, I had a job at a sandwich place and a checking account that my mother had signing authority over, which meant that I had a job and she had the money. When I complained, she'd tell me I was selfish. That word again, selfish. In my house, it didn't mean what it means in the dictionary. It meant you have something, and you have not yet handed it to your brother. The thing I want you to understand about people like my mother is that they don't think of themselves as cruel. They think of themselves as fair. In her mind, she had assigned everyone a role, the way you'd assign chores, and mine was simply to provide. My brother's role was to be adored. To her, this was as natural as gravity. You don't apologize to a river for flowing downhill. There was one good person in all of it, and that was my grandmother. My mother's mother, of all people, which I never understood. Because how do you raise a daughter that hard and stay that soft yourself? My grandmother was the one who taught me to read a contract. She'd worked 40 years as a legal secretary in Denver, and she used to sit me at her kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee and a sample lease and make me find the trap in it. "There's always a trap, sweetheart," she'd say. "The whole document exists to hide one sentence. Find the sentence." I got good at finding the sentence. It became the only thing I was ever praised for. When I was 19, she gave me her engagement ring. Not left it to me, gave it to me in person, pressing it into my palm at her kitchen table and folding my fingers over it. It was a small, old European cut diamond in a worn gold band, and it was worth more to me than anything I had ever touched. I wore it on a chain under my shirt so my mother wouldn't see it. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being correct. 3 weeks later, it was gone from the chain I kept in my dresser, and I found it that Saturday on my brother's girlfriend's hand at a barbecue where she was showing it off as a promise ring he bought her. When I cornered my mother in the kitchen, she didn't even put down the dish she was drying. "He needed something nice for that girl," she said. "Her family has money. He's trying to come up in the world. You'll get another ring someday. You're not exactly using yours." And then, because she could see my face, she added the line I have never forgotten. "Don't make this about you. It's always about you." I didn't cry in front of her. I'd stopped doing that around 14. I went home and I made a decision that I didn't have the words for yet, but that I would spend the next 12 years building toward. The decision was this: I would never again own anything that my family could see. So I became invisible, financially. I got a degree at night in paralegal studies because my grandmother told me probate was where the money and the secrets lived. And she was right. I went to work at an estate firm in Denver, the kind that handles trusts for ranching families and tech money and old oil widows. I learned how wealth actually moves between generations, which is to say, I learned that it almost never moves the way the family thinks it does. The will is theater. The trust is the truth. The person who controls the trust controls everything, and most heirs never bother to find out who that person is. My grandmother died the winter I turned 28, quietly in her sleep, the way good people are supposed to and almost never get to. And at the reading of her affairs in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and lemon polish, I learned two things. The first thing was that she had loved me more than I let myself believe. The second thing was that she had been planning for years with the same patience she'd taught me to make sure my mother could never touch what mattered. My grandmother's main asset was a cabin. I should be honest and call it what it was, because she always laughed at the word cabin. It was a 4-bedroom timber house on 2.5 acres of lakefront up near Grand Lake, with a boat dock and a wraparound porch and a view of the water that made strangers stop their cars on the road. My grandfather had built the bones of it in the 60s, and my grandmother had spent 40 years finishing it. By the time she died, with the way Lake property had gone in Colorado, it was worth somewhere north of $900,000. To my family, it was simply the lake house, the place my brother had his graduation party, the place my mother sunbathed on the dock while I cleaned the kitchen. In her will, read aloud in that conference room, my grandmother left the lake house to my mother. I watched my mother's face do something I can only describe as feasting. She actually closed her eyes. My brother squeezed her shoulder. They thought they'd won. The way they always thought they'd won, because they only ever read the document that was meant to be read aloud. What they didn't hear, because it wasn't in the will, because it was never going to be in the will, was that the lake house hadn't legally been my grandmother's to leave for 2 years. She had quietly placed it into an irrevocable trust before she died. And the trustee of that trust, the only person on earth with the authority to sell it, refinance it, or transfer it, was me. She told me about it once, the spring before she passed, on the dock with our feet in the cold water. Your mother will get the cabin in the will, she said, because if she doesn't, she'll burn this family to the ground fighting about it. So I'm going to let her think she has it. But thinking isn't the same as having, sweetheart. You remember that. The will is what they read at the funeral. The trust is what's true on Monday morning. She squeezed my hand. Find the sentence. She'd made me the sentence. For 2 years after she died, nothing happened because my mother never once thought to verify what she owned. She had the will, she had the keys. She used the house every summer. Why would she check? Checking was beneath her. Details were my job, and I'd done my job too well to ever be suspected of doing it for myself. Then my brother got into trouble. I don't know all of it, even now, and I don't want to. What I know is that my brother, who is charming the way a dropped match is warm, had spent 3 years calling himself a real estate investor without ever closing a deal, and had gotten in deep with the wrong people on a development that never broke ground. By the time it reached my mother, the number was $50,000, and the people he owed it to were not the kind who file a lien. They were the kind who send a man named Castellano to sit in a black truck outside your daughter's apartment at 1 a.m. So my mother, panicking, did the thing she'd been raised by her own desperation to do. She decided to sell the lake house. Fast, to Castellano himself, who'd offered her $50,000 in cash that night, on the spot, against a property he assumed was worth 20 times that, as a bridge until a real sale closed. He'd handed her the cash. She'd handed it to my brother. And now she needed my signature, because somewhere in the back of her mind, in the part that handled details she'd outsourced to me for decades, she had a dim memory that I had been involved in the paperwork on the cabin, and that the title situation was, in her words on the phone earlier that night, complicated, but you'll fix it. You always fix it. That was why she was standing in my living room at 1 in the morning. Not because she needed my help, because she needed my hand to move the pen, and she had never once in her life imagined that the pen might already be mine. "Sign it," she said again, dropping the folder on my coffee table. "It transfers the cabin to a holding company Castellano set up. It just needs the trustee's signature." She said the word trustee like it was a typo. "He says it's standard. Once it's done, the debt's clear and he leaves us alone. You're the only one being difficult, as usual." I opened the folder. I read it the way my grandmother taught me, slowly, looking for the sentence. It was a quitclaim deed, transferring the trust's interest in the property to a Wyoming LLC for $10 and other good and valuable consideration. There was no appraisal. There was no escrow. There was a blank notary block, which meant they were planning to find a notary who wouldn't ask questions, and a signature line that said, in clean type, Trustee, Whitaker Family Land Trust. I want to tell you what I felt, looking at that line, because it's the whole story. I didn't feel angry. The anger had been spent years ago, worn smooth like a stone in a river. What I felt was recognition. They had built, without knowing it, the perfect machine for their own destruction, and all they needed from me was to not stop it. My grandmother had a phrase for this. She got it from somewhere, I never knew where. Never reach for a man who's falling toward the only thing that'll catch you. I'd never understood it until that night. My mother and my brother were falling, and the only thing positioned to catch them was a fraud so large it would land them in a federal building. I closed the folder. "I need a day," I said. "Notary's office is closed. I have to confirm the trust language so the transfer holds up. If we get this wrong, Castellano's deal collapses and he comes back for more." That was the magic phrase. That was the lever, and I knew exactly where it was, because the worker always knows where the levers are. She didn't trust me, but she trusted the idea that I was useful, and she was terrified of Castellano coming back. So she nodded. She actually thanked me, which she did maybe twice a decade. And she went back out into the rain, and the black truck pulled away, and I stood in my apartment holding a folder full of someone else's prison sentence, and I made a pot of coffee, and I went to work. The first thing I did was the simplest. I am the trustee, and as trustee, I had every right to access the full picture. So I sat down at my own kitchen table, and I documented everything. I pulled the recorded deed from the county, the real one, the one that showed the property had been held in the irrevocable trust for over 2 years, with me as sole trustee, my grandmother as grantor. My mother's name appearing nowhere except as a remainder beneficiary contingent on conditions she had already, that very night, violated. I printed the trust instrument. I printed my grandmother's certification of trust, notarized and stamped, dated long before she died. I laid them all out side by side with the crumpled quitclaim deed my mother had thrown on my coffee table, and the contrast was almost funny. Her document was a forgery waiting to happen. Mine was the law. The second thing I did was harder, and it's the part I've gone back and forth on. My mother had, that night in my living room, told me exactly what they'd done. She'd taken $50,000 in cash from a private lender against a property she had no right to sell and given it to my brother, and was now trying to manufacture clean title after the fact. That's not a misunderstanding. In Colorado, that's theft by deception, and the moment Castellano wired or recorded anything, it became something a lot bigger, with my brother's debt and the source of his trouble braided into it. I did not call the police that night. I want to be honest about that, because the comments under stories like mine always want to know why. The answer is that calling the police would have made me the daughter who turned her family in. I would have spent the next 20 years being the villain at every funeral, the one who couldn't let it go, the one who broke her own mother. And nothing would have actually changed, because they'd have learned the lesson that they always learned, that I would step in, that I would manage the consequence, that I was the fixer. They'd have wriggled free and started again, so I didn't call anyone, I just stopped fixing. I let the machine they'd built keep running, and I made sure I had a clean, dated record of every single piece of it, and I waited for the part of the plan where they'd need a notary and a closing and a room full of witnesses. Because here's the thing nobody in my family ever understood about me. I don't break the rules. I never have. I just know exactly which rules they're about to break, and I get out of the way. The next morning, my mother called at 7 and told me Castellano wanted to do the signing at a title company downtown at noon. He wanted it official, recorded on letterhead. He brought in a real escrow officer to make the transfer look legitimate, because Castellano, it turned out, was smart enough to know that a $50,000 handshake meant nothing and a recorded deed meant everything. He wanted the cabin clean and his. My mother wanted the debt gone. My brother wanted, as far as I could tell, to not think about any of it ever again. And I wanted to be in that room with my folder. I want to describe the morning because the small things are what I remember. I made eggs. I couldn't tell you why. I hadn't eaten breakfast on a weekday in years. But that morning, I scrambled 3 eggs and ate them standing at the counter, watching the light come up over the parking lot. And I felt the way I imagine surgeons feel before a long operation. Steady. Booked. I put on the charcoal blazer I keep for court filings, the one that makes me look like someone you don't interrupt. I pulled my hair back. I put the trust documents in a hard portfolio and the forged quitclaim deed in the same portfolio on top, where I'd want it. And on the way out the door, I clipped my phone into the breast pocket of the blazer with the voice memo running. Because Colorado is a one-party consent state, which is the kind of detail my grandmother would have wanted me to know and did. The title company was on the 11th floor of a glass building near Union Station, the kind of office designed to make ordinary people feel like they're finally somewhere important. There was a conference room with a long table and a view of the mountains and a bowl of mints nobody ever eats. My mother was already there in her good navy dress, the one she wore to weddings, looking flawless and brittle, her hands folded too tightly. My brother slouched in a chair at the far end in sunglasses he didn't take off, hungover, smaller than I remembered him, the golden glow worn down to something gray. And at the head of the table sat Castellano, in a suit that cost more than the eggs I'd eaten, with a leather folder and the patient stillness of a man who is used to people being afraid of him. There was a fourth person, a tired-looking escrow officer named Mr. Halloran, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, shuffling papers and clearly wishing he were anywhere else. That detail mattered to me more than any of the others, because Mr. Halloran was an honest functionary in the middle of a crime, and honest functionaries, when shown the truth, do exactly what you'd hope. My mother stood when I came in and steered me to a corner by the window, her nails finding my elbow. "Don't make a scene," she whispered. "You sign as trustee, the property transfers, the debt clears, we all go home. I told them you handle the family paperwork, so handle it." She looked me up and down, taking in the blazer, the portfolio, the calm, and I watched something flicker across her face that I'd never seen there before. "Uncertainty. Why are you dressed like that?" she said. "Like what?" I said. "Like you're somebody," she said. And she meant it as the insult it had always been. We sat. Mr. Halloran cleared his throat and walked through the transaction in the flat voice of a man reading a menu. The trust would convey the property to the LLC. He needed the trustee's signature and a certification that the trustee had authority. He slid a single page toward me. The same quitclaim deed I'd read at 1 in the morning, now retyped on title company letterhead, with a real notary present this time, a young woman with a stamp who'd been waiting in the hall. My mother picked up the pen and held it out to me across the table, and she did the thing she does, the performance she's given my whole life. Her voice went soft and wounded. "Sweetheart," she said, "for the benefit of the room, I know this is hard. After everything your grandmother wanted, but she'd understand. Family takes care of family. Just sign and this is all behind us." I didn't take the pen. "Before I sign anything," I said, and I said it to Mr. Halloran, not to her, "I need to make sure the room understands what we're transferring. Because if the title's wrong, this deed is worthless and Mr. Castellano is going to be very unhappy with all of us." I let that land. Castellano's eyes moved to me for the first time, properly, the way a man's eyes move when he reassesses. "May I?" said, and I opened my portfolio. I laid the certification of trust on the table and turned it to face Mr. Halloran. This is the recorded certification for the Whitaker Family Land Trust, I said. Notarized, recorded with the county 2 years ago. It establishes that the lake house has been held in irrevocable trust since before my grandmother passed. I laid the next page down. This is the trust instrument naming the trustee. Mr. Halloran put his reading glasses back down and leaned in. My mother's smile was still on her face, but it had stopped meaning anything, the way a light stays on in an empty house. The trustee, I said, the only person with legal authority to sell, transfer, or encumber this property is me, not my mother. My mother is a contingent remainder beneficiary, and the trust terms void her interest entirely if she attempts to alienate trust property for personal debt, which... I set the crumpled original quitclaim down on top. The one she'd thrown on my coffee table is exactly what this document attempts to do. The room was very quiet. My brother took off his sunglasses. I don't understand, my mother said, and for the first time in my life I heard her voice without any floor under it. The will. She left it to me. It's in the will. The will gives you a house she didn't own, I said. She moved it into the trust 2 years before she died. You never checked. You don't check things. You have people for that. I let myself look at her then, fully. I was your people. Castellano leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose, and I watched him do the math faster than anyone else in the room, because that's his job. He turned to my mother. You told me you own this free and clear, he said, very softly. You took my 50 grand against a house that isn't yours. It is mine, my mother said. And now she was shrill. Now the performance was gone and the real thing was showing. I'm her mother. I co-signed. I'm the parent. The trust is she. Tricked me. She pointed at me with the pen. She did this. She's a snake. She's always been a snake. Tell them she forged it. It's recorded with the county, I said. Stamped. Dated. You can pull it from the public record on your phone. I didn't forge anything, I just didn't tell you. There's a difference, and you taught it to me. Mr. Difference, and you taught it to me. Mr. Halloran had gone very still and was now doing the thing honest functionaries do when they realize they've been brought into a crime. He stacked his papers, squared them, and said, in a voice that had stopped being bored, I can't process this transaction. There's no valid title to convey, and I'm obligated to report a suspected fraudulent conveyance and a misrepresentation in a recorded instrument. He looked at the notary in the doorway. Don't stamp anything, he stood. I'm going to make a call. That's when my mother understood all at once what was actually in the room with her. Not a difficult daughter. Not a paperwork problem. A man she owed $50,000 to. A brother she'd handed it to. A forged deed with her fingerprints on it. And a recorded trust that turned every part of the last 12 hours into a felony she had personally narrated to me in my living room. You let me, she whispered. She was staring at me. You knew. Last night you knew, and you let me come down here, and you could have stopped me. And here is the thing I had waited my whole life to be able to say, and I said it quietly because it didn't need volume. I've spent 31 years stopping you, I said. I made your lunches. I covered the bank account. I paid for things and let you take the credit. I fixed every mess. And every single time you told me I was selfish, and you took something I loved and gave it to him. I nodded down the table at my brother, who was looking at his mother now like he was finally seeing her too. Nana left me the one thing you couldn't take because she hid it inside the only thing you'd never read. And all I did, this time, was stop fixing it. That's all. I just stopped. Castellano didn't yell. Men like Castellano don't yell. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and on his way past my mother he leaned down and said something to her so quietly that I only caught it because the room was silent. The house was never the deal, he said. You were the guarantee. You and your boy. I don't lose 50 grand. Then he looked at me and to my surprise he gave me a small, almost respectful nod. The nod of a professional recognizing another professional, and he walked out before Mr. Halloran's call could become his problem. The police didn't come with sirens. It was nothing like that. Two detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit arrived maybe 40 minutes later, after Mr. Halloran's call worked its way up whatever chain it worked up, and they were almost gentle about it, which was somehow worse. They asked my mother to step into the hall. They asked my brother his name. There were words I'd only ever typed in case files: criminal impersonation, second-degree forgery, theft by deception. And they sounded different out loud, heavier, real. My brother started crying, the easy tears that had bought him out of everything his whole life, and for the first time they bought him nothing at all. My mother didn't cry. My mother looked at me across the conference room with an expression I will keep for the rest of my life because it was the truest thing she ever gave me. It wasn't sadness. It was hatred, pure and clarifying. The hatred of someone who has just understood that the person they treated as furniture had been a person the whole time. "You're not my daughter," she said as they walked her past me. "No," I said. "I stopped being your employee. There's a difference, and you never learned it." I gave my statement. I handed over copies. Originals stayed in my portfolio. My grandmother raised me right, and I answered every question. And when the younger detective asked me, off the record, capping his pen, whether I'd known what they were planning when I came in that morning, I told him the truth. I told him I'm a probate paralegal and that I know what a fraudulent conveyance looks like, and that when I see one, I get out of the way and I keep good records. He looked at me for a second and then he almost smiled and he said, "Your grandmother would have liked you." He had no way of knowing what that did to me. I walked out of that building into a hard blue Colorado afternoon, the mountains so sharp against the sky they looked cut out with scissors, and my phone buzzed in my pocket where it had been recording the whole thing. It was an email from the real estate attorney I'd retained a month earlier, the one I hadn't told anyone about, confirming that the legitimate sale I'd arranged, on my own terms as trustee, to a young family who'd cried when they saw the dock, had closed that morning. The wire had cleared. The lake house wasn't mine to keep, and I'd never wanted to keep it. It was too full of all of them. But the proceeds were going where my grandmother had wanted them, into a fund in her name for legal secretaries' kids who wanted to go to night school, and into a smaller account that, for the first time in my life, had only my name on it and no one's signature but mine. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a while before I drove. Not crying. I'd done my crying at 14. Just sitting with my hands on the wheel, listening to the engine tick, feeling the strange light weight of a debt that had been paid. Not the $50,000. That was never my debt, but the older one. The one I'd been carrying since a March snowstorm in 1993. The one that said I owed them my whole self for the crime of being born inconvenient. I didn't owe them anything. I never had. It had just taken me 31 years and a woman who taught me to find the sentence to finally read the contract I'd been living under and see that I was the one who'd been signing it, over and over every time I fixed something. So I stopped fixing. I put the car in drive and I went north, up toward the lake one last time. Not to the house, just to the water, where I sat on a public dock that didn't belong to anyone and watched the light come down off the mountains and thought about my grandmother. And how the kindest thing she ever did for me was let them think they'd won, right up until the morning it was true that they hadn't. If you've ever been the one who keeps the receipts in a family that only ever handed you the bill, you already know the loneliest part isn't the work, it's that they never once wondered why you were so good at it. The morning it was over, I sat in a parking garage with my hands on the wheel and finally understood that nothing in that conference room happened by accident. Every piece of it grew straight out of a seed someone planted years earlier. My mother spent 31 years teaching me that details were beneath her, and then she walked into a title company and lost everything to a detail. My brother spent his whole life learning that someone would always pay his debts, and so he ran one up too big for anyone to pay. Cause and effect. The lake house was never stolen from Diane. She handed it away the day she decided that reading the fine print was my job and the credit was hers. I think about what actually saved me, and it wasn't luck. It was 3 things my grandmother put in me, 1 cup of weak coffee at a time. The first was a stubborn sense of what's mine and what isn't, which kept me from ever doing what Connor did, and kept me from forging or stealing even when the people who raised me practically dared me to. I didn't beat my mother by becoming her. I beat her by refusing to break a single rule while she broke them all. The second was the patience to keep learning long after school ended, to sit with probate files at night until I understood how money really moves between generations, because the person who understands the document owns the document. My mother mistook my quiet for weakness. It was study. The third was the plain unglamorous toughness to keep showing up, to make the lunches and cover the bank account and absorb the word selfish for 3 decades without letting it rot me into someone cruel. Endurance isn't the same as forgiveness, and I learned the difference the hard way. If you take anything from what happened to me, take this. Be the person who keeps their hands clean even when no one's watching, because that clean record is the only thing that protects you when the people who wronged you start lying. Keep sharpening your mind, because the world rewards the one who read the certification of trust, not the one who shouted the loudest. And hold on, even when holding on feels like losing, because the ledger does balance, just rarely on the day you want it to. My grandmother let them believe they'd won, right up until the morning they hadn't. She didn't do it out of spite. She did it because she knew that some people will only learn the truth at the exact moment it can no longer save them. I stopped fixing my family, and the strange thing is, that's the most loving thing I ever did for them and for me, because the fixing was never love. It was just the bill, and I finally stopped paying it.